we've learned to glance at our competitors and glare at ourselves. When they said that, that just stopped me dead in my tracks.
As a community financial institution, your customer experience can be one of your key competitive advantages. Creating that experience or refining it and making it better requires a deliberate process. We have with us today Mark Arnold, president and founder of On the Mark Strategies, to talk about customer experience and how to really look at that from a competitive standpoint and approaches to take to improve that going forward. Mark, thanks for being with us today.
Hey, thank you, Rich. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to sharing some insights today.
So what are some of the things you need to think about if, whether you're at the very top of the organization or you're in charge of customer experience along those lines? Yeah. What are some of those really important factors around customer experience for that community financial institution?
Yeah, great question. It starts off really, why is this so important? Does experience even really matter? Does the customer experience matter? Is it a big deal or not? Gallup did a recent survey and analysis about banks and community bank organizations and financial institutions, and they found, Gallup did, that community financial institutions are losing 40% potential business because they do not have a great user experience or a great customer experience. So think about that. In the banking sector today, financial services sector for 2024, we're seeing that the average growth rate is probably going to be between 0 and 5%, right? Fairly moderate growth rate at best. Yet Gallup is saying the way to get really good growth is to give an amazing customer experience, a user experience, and that really 40% growth factors in that. So that's a huge number. So that's why that customer experience is so good.
Is that coming from like churn, loss of business, or is that part of the business like wallet share being lost out?
Yeah, it's share of wallet. It's loss of business. It's that you don't ask for the business. It's your business goes elsewhere. The reality is, do not assume you have all of your customers' experience. The average consumer today has about 10 financial products and services spread across 4 different financial institutions. The point is your customers, right? They're cheating with Charles Schwab, right? They're riding the wagon with Wells Fargo, and they're cavorting with Citibank. All that business going elsewhere. You need to capture that business. It is lost business. It is potential business. It is existing business that you have today that you can grow your community bank. You can grow your credit union simply by focusing more on the folks you have in place to give them a better experience, both existing and new, right? New customers as well. Because if they walk in and have a great experience, or they call and have a great experience, or they're on your website and they have a great experience, they tell others about it. And that's why it's so important. Again, Gallup is showing 40% potential business there.
So what's a good place to start? I mean, if you're, like we said, you're somebody who's responsible for the customer experience, or you're the deposit manager or something along that lines, how do you start? How do you start looking at this or trying to make an assessment or looking at benchmarks or something along that line?
Absolutely. First of all, do not assume you have a great experience. A lot of times we think, hey, our service is great at community banks or at local credit unions. Our service is great. Don't assume that. That may not be the case. So just right off the bat, don't assume that. But you have to do a couple of things, I believe, to really assess where you are today in order to get to where you want. One thing you can do is something we simply call a gap analysis. The reality is there are gaps in your experience. There are gaps in your credit union. There are gaps in your community banks. There are gaps out there. And you need to be able to identify where are the gaps. Here's an example. There can be a gap between your user experience and your strategy. That's a common gap. Or a gap between your marketing and your strategy. For example, you can say, hey, look, we're trying to reach one particular market, but you're really not doing it. You have a strategy to do it, but you're really not implementing. That's a gap between your strategy. Secondly, you could also have a gap between your user experience or your marketing and your staff. So you could say, yes, we're all about experience and things like that and whatnot. We're all about service. But then if a consumer goes into a branch, the service stinks. Here's an example. We were doing mystery shops for one of our clients a couple of years ago, and we were actually doing a whole marketing analysis, and their marketing was great. It was very innovative. It was colorful. It was really, really good. But then we got to the part of the analysis where we were trying to go into their branches and just kind of shop them and see what they were like. Their own employees were recommending that the customer go somewhere else for their financial business, right? So that's a massive gap between, right, their operation or their experience and their staff, right? So there can be a gap there. There can also be a gap between your experience or your marketing and your operations, right? If there's a gap there, that can be a problem. You can say, hey, we're all about tech and we have a great app, but then you go online or you go to your app and you start looking around and it does nothing, right? There can be a massive gap between your operations. And we saw that not in a financial institution, but you saw that at Southwest Airlines, right? A couple of years ago, they had great branding, then all of a sudden they had an operational meltdown back in the holidays a couple of years ago, and that destroyed their experience, right? So those are gap analysis you can do. Do you have gaps with your strategy, gaps with your staff, or gaps with your operations? You've got to do a gap analysis.
So I mean, nobody does that deliberately. Nobody creates that situation on purpose. No. It's not their strategy Correct. To do it. So, how does it happen? Or more importantly, how can you determine if that's the situation that you find yourself in?
Yeah, it happens by osmosis. Honestly, you just start doing things the way you've always done them. You don't look at it. You don't review. You don't assess. And I think that's one of the big takeaways is the most successful organizations today, certainly the most successful financial institutions, they are conducting an analysis, right? They are conducting an assessment of the user experience of their marketing and their branding. They do an assessment. And when you do an assessment, you find out where these gaps are. That's what a huge takeaway from an assessment is. When you do a marketing or user experience analysis, you come back and you receive the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's what an assessment's going to do for you. And then from there, you also get recommendations on how to close those gaps. It's not enough to know what they are. You got to know what to do about them, right? And so an assessment will help you do that.
And like, what frequency do you typically see? Like, what's a best practice around that? Since this isn't something that like changes all that often, correct?
Right. So I would recommend doing a marketing / user experience analysis or assessment at least every 3 years, right? Because one, things change every 3 years. Your staff certainly changes, your strategy changes, your operations change. Marketing certainly changes even faster than that. But the reality is at least every 2 or 3 years, making sure you're coming in and doing an assessment and have someone from the outside do the assessment, because sometimes we can't see the forest because of all the trees that are out there. So make sure you're doing that. Does that answer that question?
Yeah. So other than sitting down and just, trying to paper this out and think about, those 3 areas, what else can you do, or what are some good benchmarks, if you're trying to compare yourself to what's out there, or maybe trying to understand the elevated expectations from customers?
So you've got to identify, in addition to your gaps, you've got to identify your blind spots. Every community bank, every credit have blind spots. Every company has a blind spot. My company has blind spots. And you've got to be able to identify them. And there's a tool called the Johari Window that you can use. We use those with our clients, called the Johari Window. And it basically says in one corner of the window, there are things you know that others know. That's obvious. We all know that. Okay. But then there are things you know that others don't. That's internal knowledge. At a financial institution, you know far more about money and finances than the average consumer. That's just internal knowledge. Then there's a third area that's kind of no one knows. You don't know it. Consumers don't know it. That's the great unknown. Are we going to have a recession or are we not going to have a recession? No one really knows. That's the great unknown. But then the key is an upper right-hand quadrant called the things you don't know, but others do. Those are your blind spots. That's what the Johari Window does. It identifies where are your blind spots. Are there things that others know about the marketplace, that others know about marketing, that others can look at and identify that you don't know, you don't see because you're too close to them? So you've got to be able to identify them. And we found in working with community organizations and banks and credit unions all over the country, we have found really there's several blind spots that are out there that you don't realize until you have someone outside to look at that.
So what are some examples of the most common ones? Areas where you're seeing
great question.
Institutions this size really fall down or fall behind.
Yeah, for community banks and institutions, there's three main blind spots that we see. One is a lack of clarity. There's no one really knows what the vision is. You go in and ask them, they don't know. Hey, what are we about? They don't know. They're just kind of all over the place. Or the board's thinking one thing, executives thinking one thing, staff's thinking something else. There's just no clarity, right? So one huge gap is the lack of clarity. If everyone in the organization is aligned, there's nothing you can't accomplish, right? As you think about that. And the reality is that too many organizations, especially in community banks, there's a lack of clarity. That's one kind of blind spot.
And I mean, prescriptively, like, how would you address something like that? Is this a training issue? Is it a communications
part
issue?
of it's training. Part of it is just survey. For example, we do a lot of surveys and look at, and we survey different groups. We survey the executive team, we'll survey staff, and we'll just ask them some basic questions and then see where are you aligned and where are you not aligned. Are you answering the same way? But hey, what's your bank about? What you're trying to reach? So there's some survey work you can do, but Rich, is absolutely a training issue. So you've got to be able to train your employees on that. We started off this whole conversation about the experience or the user experience. Your employees are the experience, right? Your employees often are the experience. That person that's sitting in a call center, that what is that experience like when someone calls, or the person sitting in the branch when you walk in, right? They are the experience. And so if those employees are not clear about why they come to work every day, about what makes your bank or credit union different, it's not going to make a difference. You've got to have that experience. And so that's one, again, gap, is that kind of that our blind spot is that lack of clarity. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, no, got it. What else?
So two more. One is a lack of consistency, right? A lack of consistency. Here's an example. We see this a lot, is you go to one branch of a community bank and you get great service. But you go to another branch, same institution, and you get lousy service or a different experience. And here we see this all the time. And you probably see this with customers, right? A customer goes to one branch of a particular institution and they don't get the answer they wanted. So they'll drive clear across town to the same financial institution, mind you, and get a different answer. All right, why do they do that? Because they know it's different. There's no consistency. Is there consistency from branch to branch, from phone call to phone call, or from the website to the branch? Is there consistency there as well? So we really do see another blind spot as a lack of consistency, in addition to a lack of clarity.
And I mean, how does that show up from this like lack of growth or missed growth opportunity?
It shows up in a lack of growth. Number one, it also shows up in your marketing, quite honestly. Right? If we were to look at your website, your emails, your marketing pieces, is there consistency across all channels, or is there not? And a lot of times there's all kinds of different messaging, all kinds of different material that's used, and that's a lack of consistency. And that really degrades your brand, and it really prevents a lot of growth that is out there. So lack of clarity, lack of consistency really shows up in those areas. Good question. Third area that we really see too, as far as a blind spot, is lack of commitment. Lack of commitment. This goes back to the training observation. Are your employees really committed to your community bank or to your credit union? Are they really buying in, or are they just punching the clock? Are they just going in there and just doing that, and it's a job to them, and it's not really what they want to do? A lack of commitment. So lack of clarity, lack of consistency, lack of commitment. Bottom line is, in each one of those cases, you have to improve your marketing and you have to improve your training. Because if you don't do that, it's gonna kill your experience. And the bottom line, going back to how we started, Gallup says that if you don't have that great experience, you are losing as much as 40% of your business. And why? Because you don't have training, you don't have marketing. And the challenge is, in too many community banks and local financial institutions or credit unions, the first thing that gets cut in challenging times tends to be training and marketing, right? Yet that has a massive impact on the experience consumers have. And we've seen over and over again, it has to come down to the consumer experience.
So what are some ways, the frontline manager or the executive that's in charge of experience? What are some ways they can kind of get started to maybe think about this on their own, or maybe even better make the case that they need to get on this once every 3 years type audit assessment, or
Yes.
rolling it into their strategic planning?
Well, number one is I would recommend, you just mentioned, I would recommend within your strategic plan, build in and some type of assessment. Now, you can do some assessment yourselves. You can look at it, and try and do it yourself. You can do mystery shops. You can have a full-blown assessment, as we help institutions do that. But you've got to really, we recommend from the outside, but there are some internal things you can do. You can, have your family members do shops here and there, but you've got to get an assessment and know what's important. It kind of just goes back to feedback, or even just do a simple customer survey of your customers and find out what was the experience like. The challenge with those are, though, that sometimes customers lie. They want you to feel good about yourself, so they don't tell you it was bad, right? But the reality is you've got to get feedback in one way or another. Bill Gates famously says we all need people who will give us feedback. That's how we improve, right? So if you want to improve your growth, you've got to get feedback, and that's what an assessment is doing for you. So you've got to look at it, whether you do it internally or whether you do it externally. Do something, whether it's survey work, a formal marketing or user experience assessment, something to really get an honest opinion, as I said, or the good, the bad, and the ugly of where are you with your employees? Where are you with your marketing? Does that answer that question?
Yeah, I imagine the frankness of the feedback that you get, particularly the willingness to expose the bad, is, as you said, is maybe the shortcomings of a survey approach around this.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the shortcoming sometimes of asking your existing customers, because the reality is, and people, as an example, a lot of financial institutions track their NPS, their Net Promoter Score. It's a great tool. Huge fan of it. It's called The Ultimate Question. But here's what we found. You need to do a deeper dive analysis than that, because people, first of all, they're used to getting that question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to refer our bank to a family or friend? They're getting that question from every organization out there. So it's overused. People are numb to that question now. And secondly, we have found people lie, right? They want you to feel good. So they'll score you a 9 or a 10. Oh, yeah. And so your Net Promoter Score can be 60% or 70%, and you think you're doing great. But then how come you're growing at 1% or 5%? If your Net Promoter Score is, in the 60 or 70 or 80, your growth should match that. Here's what we found. A deeper level question to ask is, when was last time you recommended us to a friend or a family member, right? Then all of a sudden you'll realize, oh, well, yeah, I actually haven't ever done that. And so all of a sudden your real NPS score drops quite a bit, because they're not thinking theory. They're thinking, have you really done it? Does that kind of go a little deeper on that issue?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we've seen, particularly as you begin thinking about like very formal measurement programs like NPS, is the usefulness of a measurement goes away as it becomes a target.
Yes.
This is like very famously done in the automotive industry, where the bonuses paid to franchise owners were based on like their NPS scores. And so they were like, we are just going to game this thing to no end, because that's money in and out of my pocket around the whole item.
Right. And that's what you have. That's why I say you got to watch the NPS or the surveys. They're good tools, not knocking them. But as you said, then you can game the system. That's why a higher level or a deeper level assessment is needed, because you're getting someone from the outside who has, no skin in the game, so to speak. They're going to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly. They're going to tell you. And folks that do those marketing assessments, like our company, we're able to benchmark you against other organizations. We're able to share with you, hey, look, we work with hundreds of, financial institutions across the country. So we're able to tell you what's working and what's not working. We're going to tell you, yeah, that is not working. Here's why it's never worked before. You can benchmark yourself against others. Here's an example, like a budget. How much should you be spending on your budget? Do you know that? Do you have the national data that can support, hey, how much we should be spending? And that's another way to look at it. How much are you spending on user experience? How much are you spending on marketing? How much should you be, right? And all those kind of things can be done in a formal assessment.
This is good stuff. I think you gave us like 2 really good areas to take a look at. Mark, thanks for coming today. If people are interested and want to kind of learn more about you and what you do, where should they go?
Absolutely. If they can visit our website, it's markarnold.com. Pretty simple, markarnold.com. Or you can even email me directly at markarnold.com. Would love to chat with you. One kind of closing thought to think about, and came from a CEO of one of our clients, and we did a marketing assessment and user experience assessment for them a couple of years ago. And the CEO came back and said this quote, "We've learned to glance at our competitors and glare at ourselves." We've learned to glance at our competitors and glare at ourselves. When they said that, that just stopped me dead in my tracks. Wow, how insightful, right? One of the best ways you can grow your community bank or your credit union really is to take a deep dive look at yourself. Find out where are your gaps, find out where are your blind spots, and address those. You do that, and you will grow.
Well, thanks for being here, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rich. Appreciate it.